Morena, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this Facebook Live from the Marlborough Chamber of Commerce. I'm Pete Caldwell, the General Manager. And first of all, I'd like to introduce Paul Conway, the Chief Economist for BNZ, joining us from Wellington today. So, Morena, Paul.
Kia ora, Pete. Thanks for having me. Hata maria, everybody.
So we're here to discuss the economy and really the impact of the latest lockdown. Obviously, it's one of the key questions on our members' minds. What are the thoughts of economists going forward? What's the thoughts of the actual likely impact of the recent lockdown on the country as a whole? So a view of how big you think this lockdown impact will be, please.
Yeah, well, lockdowns are, pretty hard on the economy. They're very hard on businesses. So let's not pretend that this is an easy period. It certainly isn't. I think we're seeing it in the data. We're hearing it in stories. People are definitely doing it hard at the moment. I think, a good point of comparison, Pete, is to sort of think about it relative to the level 4 lockdown that we had last year. And in the June quarter of last year, GDP fell by about 11%. So a huge contraction. It bounced back really strongly after that. And I think that the sense, like so far in this lockdown, is perhaps that it's not as extreme as what it was last time around. And, without pretending that it's fun for anybody, I think that's the indications that we're seeing so far. But another sort of interesting thing is, like, last time spending and the economy bounced back really strongly out of that level 4 lockdown in the second quarter of last year. So in the third quarter of last year, GDP bounced, I can't remember the number, it was 14% or something like that. Just as a point of comparison, I think BNZ forecasts at the moment are for GDP to fall by something like 6 or 7% in the third quarter, and then bounce by something like 8% in the fourth quarter, and then be back to normal by sort of the first quarter of next year. Let me also say there's just heaps of uncertainty around at the moment. So, economists forecast very much for what they're worth. I think the thing that happened last year is that we eradicated the bug. We got rid of the virus. So life for many people did go back to normal. I think if we're sort of transitioning to more of a period of living with the virus instead of eradicating the virus, and I'm not sure that we are or we're not. Let's see where Jacinda sort of gets to on that one. But I think that will change the dynamics of how the lockdown or how COVID impacts on the economy, and if it is more about living with the virus. So something that's happened internationally is that spending, like, irrespective of whether an economy is in lockdown, people living in an area where COVID is transmitting through the community are less inclined to get out and spend and shop and live economically as normal. So I think that's quite a big, my view, I still think that a strong health response is the best response we can have for the economy, as well as for people. And if that's sort of, if we are changing, then, it's going to be a different picture to what it was last time. There's the potential there for it to be a different picture compared to last time, where we did see that rapid bounce back.
Yeah. So, so last time we had the situation where we went into it, and let's face it, none of us knew how long it was going to last, what it was going to mean. Every economist, I think, at the time was absolute doom and gloom, understandably, and that we were going to be looking at really high levels of unemployment. And then very quickly, those forecasts were changed. This time, do you think there's a bit of a view that people are going, well, we've been here before and we've got a bit of a feel for it, so it's not as scary? Yet actually, I guess the counter to that might be that we don't all go as mad as we did once the gates were opened last time. So do you think that the bounce back might be a little bit more subdued?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think you're right. I think there is less fear around now than there was last time, because we have been here before, and, we survived, and economic Armageddon didn't come to pass, as many economists, including the Treasury and the like, were predicting. Like, Treasury was saying unemployment hitting or getting close to double digits last year, and we've seen that's done the opposite. What is it, 4% or something? So, it played out very differently, and I think that's given us a bit more confidence this time around to, sort of ride it out The other thing is I think we're better at being in lockdown this time around. Yeah, I'm in Wellington, so level 2, same as you guys in Marlborough. It's not too bad. I mean, hospitality is still very much affected by the limit of 50, which is going up to 100. Which is good. But we've adopted digital ways of working. For example, if you look at the share of online spending and total spending, it sort of edges up over the years, but we've seen a big increase in it over lockdown. So a greater use of sort of digital tools and technologies to shop and work from home. It sort of insulates the economy from the impacts of lockdown. I think obviously vaccines are the solution to the health crisis, and in many ways digital adoption, I think, is the vaccine to the associated economic pain that comes with lockdown.
And so just to put those numbers in perspective in terms of the numbers that are being spent on the net compared to out in retail shops, how's that changed?
I could actually give you some numbers. I don't have them on the top of my head. I'm on my wrong computer. I had to use my personal computer because I couldn't get access to this through my work computer. So I don't have that in front of me. But what you see, actually, I'll send you a note, Pete. Maybe you could flick it around your people on the call after the call. You see a very clear increase, trend increase over the last 2 or 3 years. In terms of the share of digital sales or online sales in total sales. And then when lockdown hit, the first lockdown last year, when it hit, we see this massive fall in in-person sales, obviously, because we can't go out. And digital sales, they kind of hung in there. They're more resilient to lockdown. But what we're seeing this time around, we've still got that big fall in in-person sales, but digital sales have actually gone up, which is sort of why I make the point, we're getting better at living with lockdown in a lockdown type situation.
Okay, and so just moving on to kind of card spending, you published BNZ numbers just last week, and it looked like there was some positives in there.
Yeah, well, again, card spending hasn't fallen as much as it did last time around, which sort of makes sense because New Zealand, we were in level 4. It wasn't very long, whereas the 2020 level 4 lockdown was for 33 days. Obviously, Auckland, what's today, day 35, is it? I think of level 4 lockdown in Auckland. So that's pretty huge. That's significant. But overall, the impact on card spending is less extreme than it was last time around. That data you're talking about is actually 2 weeks old. And 2 weeks is a long time in economics at the moment. We're looking to update that. BNZ we're using, because we've got high frequency data. We can really monitor the economy almost in real time, which is proving really valuable at the moment. So we're updating all that stuff at the moment, and with the aim of getting a note out on it later in the week. But as of 2 weeks ago, we saw that initial kind of crash in spending, and then it actually blipped up a bit. So again, sort of adding to that story that the impacts this time around aren't as severe as they were last time around, without wanting to pretend that it's fun or anything like that. And actually, consumer confidence just came out a few minutes ago, and consumer confidence is holding up reasonably well thus far in this lockdown. Again, getting back to that point that you made earlier, there's just less fear around and a bit more confidence that we can ride this out.
So to just look, obviously, it's in terms of we've got certain sectors, and I'll come to hospitality and tourism a little bit later, but we've also got areas like Auckland who've really done it tough and really had a hard time. And to just add on to that, obviously Auckland produces a lot of what we use in the rest of the country. So how do you see that impact of their extended lockdown actually affecting the provinces and affecting Wellington and Christchurch in terms of, are there real problems in the construction industry through lack of materials that would normally come out of Auckland?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You think of it, I think of it in terms of a domestic supply chain. And Auckland is a huge part of our domestic supply chain. So if economic activity is restricted in that part of the world, that has flow-on effects to other parts of the country, other regions in the country. The fact that they're, for better or worse, entering level 3 lockdown tonight, is going to help. Like that sort of glitch in the domestic supply chain, if it's only ends up being for a couple of weeks, and if they do another couple of weeks at level 3 and then sort of join us in level 2, and we sort of end up getting to level 1, it's, in the grand scheme of things, yes, it'll have short-run economic impacts, but it's not that big a deal. I think if it was a more permanent sort of feature of our economy, markets would adjust, and a lot of that sort of productive capability would leave Auckland to places that are in a lower level of lockdown. But fingers crossed, we're not going to see that. And I should say that's all predicated on getting rid of the bug. If we kind of enter into this new world of living with COVID, I mean, who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, then all bets are off, I guess, at that point, aren't they?
In a sense. I mean, it sort of gets back to the point I was making earlier. Anything, I'm not much of a forecaster. At the best of times, now it is certainly massive grains of salt with our ability to sort of predict what's coming down the track.
And obviously, I mean, the key thing for us, we're at, I think, 37.3% fully vaccinated as of over 12-year-olds as of this morning. And we need that 37% to be 82% or 83% or higher realistically as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. Like that becomes, economically, using vaccines as our main means of fighting COVID is far better than using lockdowns.
Absolutely.
So it's just a race at the moment. Let's just get that vaccination rate up. I love that 90% thing that the Herald launched. That's where we need to get to, and then we can. That becomes the predominant means of fighting it. We don't need to go into localized lockdowns. Vaccinations plus contact tracing, we can minimize the economic disruption.
And so one question I don't think I've heard answered before is, where are we now compared to where we thought we'd be in September 2021, pre the first lockdown, pre-COVID? So if you'd, and I know it's very tricky the further out you get, but you would have had forecasts for what GDP was doing over the next couple of years. So how big has the overall hit been? Are we way, way lower than we would have been?
No,
or is it that it's tanked and then it's got back? Have we actually got back more or less to where we would have been in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, if you look at card spending, overall across 2020, it was down 6%. Like, that's BNZ card spending, which is a significant number, but it's not catastrophic. So the lesson from there was very much that lockdowns were more about deferring spending rather than cancelling it. And, and like our economy has been going gangbusters since that lockdown. Like GDP in the second quarter of this year, what was it, 2 point something, a massive number.
2.8%, I think.
Yeah, 2.8%, exactly. So, we've had, we've been massively surprised on the upside. And a lot of that is from policy, like huge fiscal stimulus, huge monetary policy stimulus. Like, sort of getting back to your question, I think the net effect of that, it's countered the impact of lockdown. So, like, I don't know if we're sort of, a bit above or a bit below or massively above,
but we're not a million miles away.
We haven't been massively pummeled by this thing. No. I mean, some parts of the economy, you mentioned sort of hospitality and tourism, that's ground zero. So there's people hurting there. That's not a good story. But in terms of the aggregate economy, we've done remarkably well.
Yeah. Okay. And so to just look at that in a world, a global setting, how do we compare briefly with our OECD partners? And I guess the follow-on to that is, you mentioned there that we've had massive fiscal stimulus, as every country has around the world. But I know in one of the previous presentations I saw from you that you made the point, because there's lots of our members, lots of voters out there who are saying, we've just mortgaged ourselves to the hilt as a country. But you made the point that actually our level of fiscal stimulus and in terms of the government gearing is very, very different to a lot of the other, very established or advanced economies.
Yeah, like our fiscal, the fiscal stimulus has been huge. We really threw the kitchen sink at this thing last year. And, credit where it's due, irrespective of your politics, the government did a good job getting that money out the door. Like, not only was it large, but they got it into bank accounts very quickly. And I think that saved a lot of firms and saved a lot of jobs. Excuse me. In terms of our debt, currently fiscal or government debt is forecast to peak at around 50% of GDP in 2023. And that is like, even though our fiscal stimulus was very large compared to other OECD economies, it was one of the largest fiscal packages in the OECD. But because our debt was low, our fiscal debt, government debt was low, not private debt, but government debt was low to start with. It was sort of trending towards 20% of GDP in 2019. Even when you add on the impacts of a strong fiscal stimulus, we're still only getting up to about 50% of GDP. And just, in Japan, it's 200 and something. In the States, I can't remember the numbers, but it's 150 or 60. And, even in Australia, it's getting up to 100. So, the fiscal debt or government debt we're going to end up after this thing is still significantly less than what it was in a number of countries we like to compare ourselves going into it. So I'm pretty relaxed on the fiscal side of things. There's a reason why we save for a rainy day. Like previous finance ministers, including Grant Robertson, have put a lot of emphasis on that sort of rainy day fund idea. It's been pouring and we've spent accordingly. And yes, we're going to have to pay it back, but it's manageable, especially with interest rates where they are currently.
Okay, one quick thing I want to say to people who are watching, look, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll put those to Paul. So just looking at kind of the government support, you said we've thrown the kitchen sink at it. I've done Facebook Lives on here on wage subsidy, on the resurgence support payment, but those payments have really been about the businesses surviving. It's just about trying to keep as many businesses getting through as they possibly can. And obviously the wage subsidy, I think a lot of people out there think that businesses benefit from that. Well, they don't. They just pass it on to their staff. The benefit is that they keep those staff, for the future when they get back out of lockdown. But do you think there's been enough support for businesses? I mean, I look at the resurgence support payments at $1,500 plus $400 per full-time equivalent person there. And that's going to pay, I don't know, maybe the electricity bill, but it's not going to pay for the business. And so what are your thoughts in terms of what the government have done? Because I absolutely agree with you. Wage subsidy, one of our members spoke to me, he said he applied at 11:30 and he had the money in his bank for the following 2 weeks' wages at 2:30 that day, which is staggering. So that's been really effective. But what are your thoughts in terms of the support overall that they've given to businesses? And I guess particularly hospitality and tourism.
That's a really difficult question to sort of come to an answer on. I think, given how well our economy has performed since, that combination of fiscal support and monetary support, the fact that interest rates are so low, it's been more than adequate to stave off the worst effects of lockdown. So you kind of think, what's it for? It is a fiscal payment that is designed to help businesses survive lockdown. So it's not, it's not to encourage innovation, or it's not to, it's not a grant to
just to get through.
It is about surviving. Absolutely. And and now I think less businesses have applied, like the fiscal or the data that we're seeing coming through BNZ deposits. It's a bit smaller this time around in terms of number of businesses applying or getting wage subsidies, and partly that's because the impacts are so far less severe this time around. So that sort of makes sense. The other point I'll mention, and this is sort of the delicate balance of getting fiscal support right. Unfortunately, like in tourism and hospitality, I think hospitality is it'll bounce back. Like eventually we'll get there, and we like going to the pub and restaurants, so it'll get there. Tourism, I think there's been some fundamental changes in people's view to travel. Like I think it's an industry that is, we sort of took a mass market approach to tourism. And I'm just not sure in terms of changing consumer preferences globally, if we're going to go back to that world. So there are going to be some casualties in terms of business failures in that part of our economy. So you want to get the fiscal, like you don't want the government support to sort of stand, as painful as it sounds, there's some businesses in that part of the economy are going to go through this sort of creative destruction process that economists talk about. There is going to be destruction, resources are going to move out of areas of economic activity where demand has just fallen away from consumer preferences changing. And you don't want fiscal policy to sort of draw that out. So it becomes more about supporting people that are caught up in that transition. Like I absolutely think that, we need to support each other on our way through this. But it becomes more about supporting the individuals involved rather than keeping a business going whose business model isn't really appropriate for the new world that we're entering into. Otherwise, we'll end up with zombie firms a year or two down the track that aren't well suited to the new sort of environment. So there's a balance there, support so that people's livelihoods stay intact through this, but not so much that we slow down that process of economic adjustment in the areas of our economy where it has to happen, and indeed, help focus more on people in those spaces to help people through that very difficult, transition, those changes.
And obviously, we've seen a lot of tourism businesses really, and I hate the word, but we use it, so pivot and change what they're doing and really make it work strongly in terms of the domestic market. I guess it's inevitable that they're going to need to continue to do that. But I suppose the other side to that is not post-pandemic, but when we've got to the stage where the 90%, where we say now we'll live with it because we're not going to eradicate it completely further down the track once we open the border. So say 2 or 3 years time, do you think that the way in which we've weathered the COVID storms so far will have an attractive feel for people in terms of visiting New Zealand in the future? Because the New Zealand story is one that is repeated in newspapers the world over.
Yeah. Like I think our global integrity at the moment is through the roof. It's sky high. And part of that is just that we have managed to, we're one of the most successful countries in the world in terms of our combating the disease, the virus thus far. And I think it has thrust us into the sort of global consciousness. And I think we are on people's, radars a lot more than we used to be, which is, it's exciting. So I guess there is, we will get international visitors. We will open up progressively, probably over the course of next year once vaccine rates do get up to that 90% mark. So there will be some sort of bounce back in the tourism sector, but I just don't think it's going to go back to the way that it used to be. Like I think there is a big impetus on businesses in that part of the economy and other bits of the economy as well. To change their business plan, and whether that's about pivoting to domestic tourism or whether it's about creating digital experiences for people. I don't know, there's clever business people out there that will be mulling these things over. Can I just add, more generally, like as painful as it is what we're going through at the moment, I would not be surprised if we look back 5 or 10 years down the track and we see this COVID moment as a real time in our economic history when we actually started to address our longer run structural issues, our poor productivity, that sort of thing. I think now is a real opportunity for New Zealand to build a stronger economy that delivers for all Kiwis. I know it's tough at the moment, but there's sort of an element of excitement there as well about the possibilities once we do get through this thing. And I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Because it's stress testing businesses for the future and making them look at things differently.
Yeah, exactly. Like necessity is the mother of invention. And, there's, I think there's a lot of businesses, in no disrespect, there's a lot of businesses in New Zealand that have sort of cruised for over the recent decades and sort of done things the same way, and they've sort of been able to get away with that. And I think now is a real time to sort of just think, well, actually, is there a more efficient way of doing what we do? Is there a business model that sort of delivers benefits for workers and investors, that we weren't sort of utilizing because, there wasn't any pressure on us to do so? I think there's a lot that businesses can learn from what we're going through at the moment, with a view to strengthening, that longer run economic performance. I'm really looking forward to the productivity numbers coming out, like globally around COVID. Chances are, often recessions, they sort of have they do tend to, you see sort of poorer performing firms tend to disappear. So there is a sort of process of resource allocation towards better performing firms, which is good for aggregate productivity. That's kind of in the here and now, the stress of the current moment. And then down the road, if they sort of, again, lead to more innovation, adopting tools and technologies and better ways of doing things, they can sort of feed into they can sort of have a cleansing effect, I guess. So, as tough as that sounds, I don't mean to sound like a callous economist, but these are the dynamics that we see in the data around events or around recessions. We haven't, and pandemics, they tend to sort of emphasize changes or trends that were already underway in society. And clearly one such trend for us now is around digitization. And I'm a big advocate for a digital New Zealand economy. I just think technology is moving in ways that suit us down here in the South Pacific. And if one of the sort of effects of this pandemic on New Zealand businesses is that it encourages digital adoption, then again, it's another reason to be optimistic about our long-run economic future.
Okay, so I want to come to productivity again in a couple of seconds, but one of the questions from Dave in the chat is, and I know this is a question I bet you get asked wherever you go, we've got low interest rates at the moment, and obviously people are certainly stimulating the housing market at the moment. Where do you see those interest rates going over the next 12 to 24 months?
Or up. That's the short answer. I think, well, like the Reserve Bank would have already moved in.
Yeah, they were going to, weren't they?
Yeah, last month. Like we were literally one day away from the beginning of a tightening cycle. The only reason they didn't is that we went into level 4 lockdown, which is totally appropriate. It's not the dumb thing to start raising interest rates just as the country's gone into a lockdown. But if things do transpire, and the fact we had such a huge GDP number in the second quarter, I think most economists and I think market pricing has sort of just been about pushing that tightening cycle out. So I think we're predicting a 25 basis point increase, and a kind of series of small steps sort of feeling their way. Like I don't think we're going to see a huge, we're not going back to the bad old days where policy rates were kind of 7, 8, 9%. I think, we're a bit more indebted, like private sector debt has gone up over the last year or so. So in a sense, the economy is a bit more sensitive to interest rate changes. So the RB doesn't have to sort of go as hard or go as far as it would have, because, I think, you kind of mentioned housing. And there's definitely, I'm in the camp that thinks there's a bit of a bubble in the housing market, and sort of pricking that is a delicate balance, without the whole thing sort of just sort of blowing up in your face. I should say I think the Reserve Bank are totally up for that. Okay. That's sort of what they do before breakfast. So I think we'll find that path. But I think it's a path where the increase in interest rates isn't as extreme as what we've seen previously. But definitely,
so in terms of people's concerns out there, the idea that we would return to the highest levels in the OECD by a country mile, as we were for years and years and years, you think the fundamentals have changed on that now?
In terms of interest rates, are you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, relative to other countries, because other countries have sort of had similar structural things going on as well. But yes, I don't think we're going to see as bigger cycles in interest rates as what we've seen previously back in the bad old days. And part of that is that people's inflation expectations are sort of better anchored. We don't expect inflation to sort of get away on us. Although there's plenty of inflationary pressures in our economy at the moment. But if our economists, we talk about inflation expectations being well anchored, and the job of the Reserve Bank, over recent decades, it's sort of built up that credibility that inflation isn't going to get sort of wildly out of the box as it did in the 80s and 90s. So as long as we sort of keep that up, and that was hard fought and hard earned, like we wouldn't, there's no sign of that sort of disappearing. It sort of means that we don't have to throw interest rates around and throw the sort of real side of the economy around as much to keep inflation low and stable.
Okay, so just in terms of looking at, I guess some of the sectors in Marlborough, obviously viticulture is major, aquaculture is major, forestry, construction is really important to us, and as is the case in most places, real estate is really important to us. So just looking at some of those first ones, those big exporters, what's your take on, we're seeing major issues in terms of freight, in terms of shipping, not just in timing, but also in terms of those costs going up. What are your thoughts on how businesses are going to weather that storm going forward in those sectors?
It's tough. It's tough. Like I think the primary sector has been one of the reasons why our economy's been so resilient since the initial lockdown last year. Those guys just sort of kept on going through lockdown, and then the world came to meet us in the form of high commodity prices. So that's been a real strong source of resilience in our economy. Let me just shut that door. I don't know if you can hear that noise or not.
No problem.
So that's great. It's a bit dark now. Anyway,
don't worry, it's fine.
But in terms of like the here and now of it, absolutely, supply chain disruptions, I think, are a major handbrake. I think cool stores around the country are bursting at the seams just for the reasons you talk about. It's really hard to get a container out of here at the moment. If you can, it's sort of costing you 3 times what it did, this time last year. When the supply chain thing sort of broke and became a thing, I was sort of saying, well, markets will sort that out. Markets are very good at sort of operating around constraints. So I was reasonably optimistic that it wouldn't last that long, but kind of the deeper we go, I don't want to hazard a guess, Pete, at how long we're still going to see these supply chain disruptions. I think it's possible that they're around for some time, and I know it's a handbrake. It's called. I don't know what can be done about it. It's sort of all the COVID impacts externally, but also bottlenecks in New Zealand ports. In a way, it's sort of throwing up issues that we should have been dealing with, pre-COVID. It's brought a lot of that sort of home to roost in terms of our, getting containers out of the country, in terms of bottlenecks around New Zealand ports. So,
and I guess one of the other focuses that you've always had from previous roles, and also that I think is becoming more and more apparent within our region, as well as across New Zealand, is productivity and low productivity. We know we've got too many low-paid jobs here and not enough which really have value added to them. One of the comments I made the other day is, in my time in the viticulture and wine sector, often you talk to people with new bits of kit that they were excited about, and they'd say, yeah, we've got this and it's coming from Sweden, or it's coming from Switzerland or Italy or France, rather than saying, we've got this amazing Kiwi bit of kit which we're going to sell to Napa and everywhere else. So what's your take on productivity, and what are the real things that we've got to do as a country, but also as a region, to make some differences?
Yeah, like the way we sort of grew our economy pre-COVID, like the sort of engines of economic growth, if you like, a lot of it was around housing. People sort of feeling wealthier as the value of their house sort of went up year after year. I don't think that's going to continue. I think we're building more houses than ever at the moment. I think things have changed in terms of the regulatory landscape around housing for the better, but slowly. And at the same, and the other sort of key driver of growth was population growth. So we grew our population by about 2% a year for the 5 or 6 years prior to COVID. The population growth to the year to June this year was 0.6%. So those two key drivers of growth, they've gone. Like they're not. That's not how we're going to sort of roll from here on. So these are fundamental challenges to our model of economic development, and it just raises the question: well, where is growth going to come from? And you won't be surprised, Pete, to hear me say that it's going to come from productivity. It's, again, it's getting back to that point. It's really forcing New Zealand businesses to think about how can I do stuff better. And your kind of point about, adopting technologies that have been developed offshore, that's totally legitimate. Like technological adoption, like innovation is not necessarily about sort of pushing the frontier out. For a lot of New Zealand businesses, it's about how do we sort of catch up and move towards that productivity frontier or that technological frontier in the industry. So it's about looking at leading firms in your industry, both domestically and globally, and saying, well, what are they doing? That means they're sort of creating more value from an hour of work. And sure, there's going to be a cohort or a group of New Zealand firms that are operating at that global frontier, and their job is to push it out. And I think there's a lot of excitement around tech firms in New Zealand. That's great. But I think there's a huge opportunity for not leading firms, just regular sort of firms, businesses, New Zealand businesses, to use technologies in different ways and sort of catch up to the frontier. I think the growth impacts of that can be huge. And the nice thing about that is it's inclusive growth, because those sort of non-leading or lagging firms, they tend, as you say, a lot of the jobs there are low-wage jobs. Because their productivity is low. So as they sort of improve their productivity, that also allows them to pay better wages. And, the cost of labour is going up. The labour market is extremely tight. So that's the other sort of key theme at the moment is labour market shortages. And I think that is going to persist for some time. I think there's going to be reticence around opening the border with Delta. I think we'll get there, but it's going to take a while. And the government is serious about a reset in the migration space. So I think that sort of tap of, low-skilled imported labour, we're just not going back to it'll improve from where it is now. But I don't think we're going back to those old days of really sort of consistent, dependable stream of workers coming in from offshore. So again, it gets you to thinking, well, what's plan B? If we can't grow by sort of throwing workers at the business, how else are we going to do it? And the answer is by adopting, investing in capital and adopting new technologies and new business models and thinking hard about how to improve effectiveness, improve productivity. So that's a challenge. But the flip side of that challenge, if we get it right, and I'm a firm believer in New Zealand ingenuity, and I think our businesses are totally capable of rising to that challenge and getting us to a stronger place than we were pre-COVID.
And I guess in terms of those, we talk about them being sometimes low-paid or low-skilled jobs, but actually, when you look at some of those jobs, they're highly skilled. I watched a pruning video on LinkedIn the other day, and this guy it was like watching a concert pianist at work. His ability to prune a vine accurately and with incredible speed was just staggering. But yeah, we, as you say, pushback in terms of number of RSE workers not going up or not increasing as much as it might have otherwise done is certainly causing some pressure at the moment for us as a region. And to Alistair's question in the chat, and we'll draw it to a close relatively soon, but we've got an employment in Marlborough, as it says on the screen, 3%. And yet we've got employers just not managing to fill the jobs that they've got, and only, 400 people or additional 400 people in terms of job seeker support. How do we?
The region is an additional 400 people. I mean, 400 people doesn't sound like a great deal. So you're saying that
it's
are
nothing.
tight.
We think we've got a shortage of 4,000, or at the moment there are a range of numbers quoted around Marlborough, but anywhere between 2,500 and 4,000 job shortages or people shortages in the coming 2 or 3 years.
You know, well, you know, like part of that is what we've been talking about, that if you can't get labor, get a machine to do it, or get some bit of kit to do it. And that probably sounds a bit glib, because easier said than done. Very well for me to sit here in Wellington, you know, sort of spouting that type of message. The other point I'd make, you know, to Alistair's point about this, you know, if there is an imbalance, it comes down to skills. And, you know, New Zealand, we have a long, sorry history of skill shortages in this economy. That's how you can have low, you know, high sort of demand for labor and unemployment at the same time. Like they're not, the people that are unemployed don't have the right skills to fill the jobs that are on offer. So, you know, like Pete, I've sort of spoken reasonably optimistically about New Zealand's economic future, and you know, I'd sort of do that out of the potential for new technologies to sort of take our economy to a new level. But I'm not saying that that's going to just happen automatically. It's not a forecast, if you like. It's a scenario where we do the work, we do the mahi that's in front of us to make the most of the opportunity, you know, be it the digital opportunity or the technological opportunity, which COVID is sort of putting in our faces. And a key part of that work that we need to do is to get our education system working better in terms of supplying the labour market with people that have got the skills that are in demand, so we don't get those mismatches. You know, we've you know, and again, COVID is sort of really bringing this home. Like we've tended to rely on imported workers to fill skill gaps rather than having an education system that's really attuned to demands coming out of the labour market. So migration has sort of acted as a foil for deficiencies in our education system. And this is notwithstanding the amazing efforts of many wonderful teachers, you know, and lecturers and profs at university. But there's something a bit broken in the New Zealand education system, and we see that in the data. Sorry?
Yeah, a bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, a bit of a disconnect. Like if you look at the PISA data across 15-year-olds, you know, 15-year-olds or 2018, the last time we had data, you know, their abilities in terms of reading, maths and science are less than they were for Kiwi kids, 15-year-olds, 20 years earlier, sort of thing. So there's been you know, the quality of our education system has fallen, but also there's also this issue of skill gaps. You know, we've had skills on the skill shortage list that MB sort of uses as a basis for migration decisions that have been there for decades.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, it's about having an education system that you know, skill shortages shouldn't persist. Like yes, the economy can change and the demands coming out of the labour market can change, you know, relatively quickly as people's preferences and technology changes. But our education system should adapt to that. So we can have a skill shortage for, you know, a couple of 3 years or something until we get the kind of new cohort of learners coming out of our education system to meet that skill gap. It's something we haven't been particularly good at. So, you know, if you ask me what's the one thing we can do to make the most of the, you know, huge opportunity in front of us, I would say get the education system right. Although I have a list of many other things as well, but that's a good place to start.
It's a good place to start. I mean, it's a big challenge. We as a chamber have got the Chris Shaw, our education to employment broker, and trying to bring businesses together with schools to manage that gap, I think is a key
That's
part
the way. That's good stuff. Yeah, like linking businesses into that.
Look, I'm aware of time, so we'll draw it to a close, but hopefully we might do another one of these again, because this has been fascinating, and I'd love to chat to you about, you know, the global economy and more about the New Zealand economy. But in terms of I guess, summation, am I right that we're saying, look, yeah, we know it's been brutal for so many specific business sectors, but that actually most have shown a real resilience because they've not just lost their market in the way that tourism have. They've bounced back pretty well. And also it's been that stress test that you need in economic terms every once in a while to make people look differently, to make people look at making a step change in their business.
Absolutely. Yep. That's a good summation, Pete.
Hey, look, I really appreciate your time. As ever, it's been fascinating to hear your views, and hope that
get me back. I'm keen to chat, especially at the moment.
Really appreciate it. Take care.
All right, thanks. Ka kite,
Cheers,
everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.